나 되게 조용한 좀 가르쳐 버려라나. 디바 샤고 베기 김제로 시카르스나. 당아서 대화 되바다 동아미 되바래. 진짜 동아세야다. 디기 죽고 인자네 디바 김센티레스. 하지만 대화 동아대야 류기 대화다 심기 동아나 류레 때문에 동아니 용거래. 진짜 디나네다 심레 때문에 동아되게 누베차와. 디나진 대화 되라야 류레 때문에 대화다 심레 때문에 대화니 나네 심레 때문에 대화도 채와지. 다던달라 저기 디기 죽디 다른 저기 동아세야다 디기 죽이기 나버상기 비기 점년디게 손시비 취나는 냠는 제단들 조 심라 템비기 동아세다다 아니 심라 템비 디기 죽다 송고레스 제자디 송바된 상이 점년디 코롱기 아니 직 냠는 제 냠용을 토네 안도스네 마송여레스 되네 송바텔라야 하상이 점년디게 탑라 케비 토네 아니 감다 매바 두지 삼바 튠비 토네 아니 직 어두스네 송샤겨레스 되네 장한저야 델야 아니 이시제제 안디기 점nen디게 손시비 취 델야 동아세야데 디기주다딜라 아니 퇴바다 삼바제 되네 검제네 냠내 제거디게 지모레세지 디시 먼저 조회셔야데 되네 거시로와.
Now, in our previous session then, we looked at the first of the outlines that I'm going to present, which is the reason for purification. And this is, in brief, is not wanting to suffer, but wanting to experience lasting, stable happiness. We need to purify our minds. And whilst looking at this first outline, we looked at how there are two general sources, two sources in general from which our suffering comes, either from a physical source, our physical aggregate, or our mental aggregates, our minds. And so both happiness and suffering come from these two sources. And amongst the two, we looked at that there's actually very little compare between them, in that the mental source is so much more powerful than the physical source, both in terms of suffering as well as happiness. And we spoke about how if one is experiencing suffering that has come from a mental source, it will overpower everything else. Likewise, if one is experiencing happiness that's come about from a mental source or risen within the minds, then this too will be more powerful than any physical suffering. And then thirdly, we looked at how the Buddha Dharma focuses primarily, almost exclusively, on the cultivation of our minds, our mental development. And this is done through, on one hand, purification, and on the other hand, accumulation of good qualities. So the Buddha Dharma is very different presents very different techniques from what is generally found in the world, which focuses primarily, largely, on the outer world, on overcoming problems through transforming the outer world. The Buddha Dharma focuses almost exclusively on the inner world. And amongst those guides, those teachers who present techniques for the cultivation of our inner world, cultivation of virtuous qualities and elimination of faults, the Buddha is supreme. The Buddha is the supreme guide because, due to having perfected all good qualities and completely eradicated all faults, is able to guide beings perfectly in accordance with their own individual karmic backgrounds, their own individual dispositions and inclinations. This we need to gain conviction of, and because through gaining conviction of this, to encourage us to spend our time receiving teachings, reflecting on them, meditating on them, and doing so repeatedly over a sustained period. So that's in brief what we looked at in the previous session.
난 다듯이 해딩하죠. 단 지기 대선 마소니바디 대화 동화세다 대화세디게 이나 자와 안 셈라티네 셈라 두고래 셈라티네 용고래세지 아디 고마시어 그러나.
We'll look at the second outline, which is that the root of our suffering comes from within our minds.
그래서 먼저 저게 다들이 또 하는 셈이야 장도 시고래 세상이 좀 nen디기 Digi Thubten Dunga said on the Zo Simlia, Duche, Sim Jong Dorje, and Yamlin Chehore, Chue Sherwana. Chisadi Simnat in a Jondo Chogo, but Jumzen Garrelabna, also Dewa Dunga Chazan, it's our Simnat in the Incore, Chisa, it's our Simnat in the Incore. The name Zang, and also Simla Chando Chehore, City, Shue, the Shehore Kimzen Rotiria.
Here in the second outline, we'll look at that the root of all happiness and suffering is mental, it's within our minds. So this ties very closely to the first outline that we looked at in the previous session, which is that the Buddha Dharma focuses on our mental development, on transforming our minds. And the reason is now what we'll come to. The reason why the Buddha Dharma focuses on mental development is that it's the root of all happiness and suffering is found within our minds.
Duji yung obo she kan chi ne yu dan jian ji le dui ne yong ko re se zhen yu dan jian la ma de ba an de yong yong ma de se zhen dong yi ne yu dan jian le den zhu bu ko re de wai ne yu dan jian ji le den zhu bu ko re se zhen yu dan jian le den zhu bu re ne chi yung obo xin da zi xin da ka re shi ne yu dan jian le den zhu bu du a di na xin ne ji ba re se wo le
to then understand why it's stated, while I'm stating that the root of all happiness and suffering arises within our minds. Well, let's look at compounded phenomena or impermanent phenomena. Whatever the impermanent phenomenon is, whether it's something material, such as matter, something composing of matter, whether it's things that we hear, or taste, or smell, touch, as well as our bodies, of course, as well as all mental phenomena, all our various minds. All of these are impermanent, they are compounded phenomena, which means they are dependent arisings, dependent on causes and conditions. And this includes inner phenomena such as happiness and suffering. Happiness comes about in dependence on causes and conditions. Suffering comes about in dependence on causes and conditions. So in brief, all impermanent phenomena, everything that it changes momentarily, whether it's material or an inner phenomenon, these are all impermanent. They all come about in dependence on causes and conditions.
Zanda gyudan jianji le tene yungu bena anna da nga zugi deshi shwe she ba na shi nga zo ane lu lu ya tempe ge dunga mong bu shor an cha be dunga le ya dang an cawa ci be dunga le ya dang an je ba ka kom be dunga an ro do be dunga an lu lu ya ma su de ni ge dunga mong li gi do as 제주 샘네 되네 가는 연구를 샘네 팀바스가 책임이다. 그래서 류를 때에 호로 류를 안에 칼라마세도 안에 가서 저것도 원래 그 동안 리고를 왔어. 안에 수불야 안에 장외라서 숙침부터 캬베 동안 리고를 안에 차와 숙침을 차외 동안 리고를 수불을 마서나 안에 마차 나이 동안 리고를 마도 안에 샘네 가는 때에 샘네 가 대화 민도와 샘비 삼로 용식으로 와.
This morning we spoke about two sources of suffering, physical and mental. We spoke about suffering that arises independent on our physical aggregate, our body, being sufferings relating to heat and cold, hunger and illness and so forth. So here one may think, okay, I understand that, for example, that I experience heat is dependent on my physical body, I experience cold is dependent on my physical body, I experience hunger. That too is dependent on my physical body, as of course is illness. But then the question may come: but are these also dependent on one's mind or not? Are they solely dependent on our body? Are these sufferings solely dependent on our body?
세상에서 류를 때 비동아 영향을 쳐서디 가서 류들을 때 리고로 와죠. Ludi mena, and Deniki Dunga Chabi Dungada, Desu Dunga Dini Rasio Maris. It's a Lule Dini Ungores. Tizanganzu Ludi and the Ganis Tugore, Lana, Tanganzu Rapa some Tavaina, Anzu Ludi, and Anzu Aman Makia do, Dene Amigu Subuna, Ludi Tugor, what else Subuti Tugorwa. Di Drutang the Ganis Tugore, Lana, and Anzawa, and it's Pamani, and Tevala, Dene and Ludi Tugore. Just Pamani Tabala and Pamani Nigala Chasam Gura, Pinsu Chasam, the Denigitone, Chasam Gene, and Digitone, and it Pamani Tubala Dene, Mazu Ludi Tuyaji Chago, Chazanga Lu to be a Guchik de, Guda Yogi, Guchik Pamani, and the Tichur Shipake, Jagi, Kunogi, and the Chapasim, Chapasim, Chagore. So the Denigi Chabine, Mazu Ludi, and similar Tempa Chagore, Carson, Chapel Simdi, Chapegi. Simpson that the gaps with Sim said, Shabal Kugurwa, Mother Injit, and the Sim that Sim Ju says Sim Lugo Marachida Sims, or the Nichile, Yomobal in Trupurwa.
The reason that it said that something such as hunger, heat, cold, illness arise independent on our body is because that if we did not have this body, we would not experience those sufferings. So they come about independence on this body. In this body, how did we achieve this? Well, it's come about independence on causes. So those causes, on a very coarse level, we all know. We are born from our mother's womb. But to be born from our mother's womb, we needed to be conceived. And we were conceived in her womb, and independence on that, we were later born from her womb. But being conceived in her womb, this also came about independence on causes, and that those causes were our parents sleeping together. Our parents sleeping together, this too came about independence of causes and conditions, because all of these are impermanent phenomena. So our parents slept together, independence on their attachment. So independence on their attachment, they slept together, we were conceived, we were born, and thereby we have this body. So when we trace back like this, we can see that the stream of continuity started with our parents' attachment, which is, of course, a consciousness, and that attachment is an afflicted mind. So it started from an affliction, the affliction of attachment.
Tene is a dang to Ludi Yang, Pamani, Chason Yoba, Zami, Dizami, Yang, Mazuli to go, Chesa Dinesa, Della Yang Zaviki, Guzo, the Karku, Mazu, Kiawang Amagi, and Yama, Mazu, Teneki, Lutubiaki, and the Sadibi, Kuchiko, and the Miluna, me, Ludi Tubiaki, Kutu, me, Kiawaleaki, and then answer Kiawama Surum Soyach Kugorwa, the Nichikugore, same chile Tugore.
So that is one cause which for everyone is really easy to understand, but it's not the sole cause that led to our attainment of a body. The mere arisal of attachment and that being followed through by our parents, that alone doesn't lead to conception. From our side, we also needed to have acquired relevant cause, which is namely karma that we ourselves accumulated, contaminated karma that in a previous life we had accumulated. And as we achieved a rebirth in a happy migration, that karma would have been virtuous, would have been from ethical restraint or ethical conduct. From ethical restraint, we accumulated contaminated virtuous karma, and that too was one of the causes that was crucial for us to later attain this body. And this contaminated karma that we accumulated through ethical restraint, this too is a consciousness. So we have the affliction, which is a consciousness, ethical restraint. This is also consciousness.
And the Danyamdo Surim Chibu Chegamar and Surim Denigi Yamdo, Zavi Yomon Kuno de Langa Zugidine, nyomo passage, nyomo marik passage, you are marik passage. Chisa nyomo marik passage, Anzuki, nyomo bakie, so dire. The name Zang to Ludi Karitin to Boresena, Anzu Midi Lushina, Tangazu Chikowalia, Nyawa, Ida, Dundro, me, said the Denigi, Kowalia, Gets a Ludi Chazan got to Boresene, lay down your mobility to go. Just a lay down your mobility. Lay down your mobility, same Shepachadi or just as a Jidan is in the same Sikota. The Nigi, the name Zang, Anzu to a goody. So did I lay down your mobile two by Zawa and the similar thing, the two similar two or said that two became zero.
We've seen then that we can trace back to two streams of causes, one coming from our parents' side, which go back to the afflicted mind, the other to ourselves, we of ethical restraint, karma we created there, a virtuous mind. But these have behind them the deeper afflicted mind of ignorance of true grasping. That is the root cause. The stream of karmic activity comes about through or propelled by ignorance of self-grasping. In this ignorance of self-grasping and its resulting minds, whether virtuous such as ethical restraint or afflicted such as attachment, it's from this same root cause that everything that is contained within samsara, everything that is found within samsara comes about. All contaminated karma comes from the root cause of ignorance of true grasping. Ignorance, of course, is consciousness, ethical restraint, consciousness. As two is the affliction of attachment, all consciousness.
Kowali ke ludi chasan karil den dukur san zawa angazo leda nyomo ba selatine ndupti ba yinza chasan leda nyomo ba wangi ke kowali ya ke bi ludin de ludi yesawe chela ana gedi ina ana nasa da gangachi 균 마체가 중요해야 최고래. 그래서네 그 수부 코론 류 코론라 균 주의를 봐자 델이야. 아니 지고 기디나 가브리엘이야. 아니 지 되선 면주의 제신 자송반에 한 발갑질량 제리아 나슬레하다. 기디나 되스til레는 나초초다. 아니 지 강아 태시 동아형시 류레팀이 동아형초초 최고. 그래서 디차고바디 가르스네 류레팀이 동아형한테 가서 류 코론이야. 아니 지 동아에게 교회에게 되니게 싫어서 네 돼요. 그래서는 류코론에 귀디 레다 녀몽발레데 끼리 봐서 귀디 야고 말해. 귀 야고 해봐서 디 데보데 야고 해봐래. 지사 데보데 야고 해봐서 장마가지 세베네 남상나사 아니 저거 차행으로 어디나 지고서 되스 최단제제 되스 통과잖아요. 되스 말에 나용 거야. 되스 삽사치도 야 되스네 나용. 되게 되네 동아세디 류레티베 동아디 귀 맞춰 용도야 차디 디차고래.
What samsara is constructed from, perhaps one can say, is this contaminated karma and afflictions. And moreover, it's a contaminated karma and afflictions that keep cyclic existence turning, and ordinary beings such as ourselves continuing to take uncontrolled rebirth again and again and again. It continues for all of us ordinary beings to experience problem upon problem. And so this body we've looked at, this physical body we have, has been achieved independence on contaminated karma. And this contaminated karma is accumulated by afflictions. Even where virtuous minds are involved, such as ethical restraint, there's still ignorance there. So there's still ignorance of self-grasping. And so therefore, this body having come about through this continuity of contaminated karma and afflicted minds, this body too is contaminated. In that, therefore, we experience sufferings. It's a basis for suffering. For example, illness and the various other problems that we physically experience. And so sometimes we maybe will heal from our illnesses, sometimes we won't, sometimes we stay sick for a long time, medicine isn't effective, and so forth. Sometimes we're sick, we heal, we get sick again, sometimes we're sick, and before we heal, another sickness afflicts us. This is our situation. And the reason for this situation is this body we have achieved is contaminated because it's come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflicted minds.
Di Gulia, Nyomo Mebache, Gawajang, Gidushabi Luchina, and Ludile Tempegi, Navi Dungada, and the Chikitsavi Dunga, Chabe Dunga, and the Ditungadi, Yungomare.
So I hope then, when we through this through presenting how we achieve this life through these two streams of karma, which came from one side from our parents, one side from ourselves, that these are interlaced, interwoven with the afflictions, primarily the ignorance of self-grasping. We see that in this way we achieve contaminated aggregates, and therefore we have this basis upon which suffering is experienced. Therefore, these aggregates are called true suffering. They are in the nature of suffering. If, on the other hand, or let's put it another way, those beings who have a body that wasn't achieved in this way, they have a body that came about independent on pure virtue, uncontaminated karma. They do not have a body that's a true suffering. They do not have a body that is a basis for suffering. And therefore, they will not experience a physical suffering like we've been talking about, heat, cold, illness, and so forth. Because the causes are different. The causes are uncontaminated karma because of the absence of afflictions.
Gulia and the Casa Migewa Migewa, Yomo Migewa, Migewa Yudivayanza, Manzuludela, and the Yabu Mevare, Chesa, Nenas Young way the Kumzero, the Chagorwa.
Beings who are in that position are those who are Arya Bodhisattvas. So Arya Bodhisattvas, their cause for rebirth is pure virtue and prayer. And because of such a cause, the body that is attained is not in the nature of suffering, and therefore they will not experience any illness, any heat, any suffering from heat, any suffering from cold or illness. Again, because their karma is not non-virtuous, and it was not accumulated under the influence or through the afflicted minds. Therefore, their physical aggregate is completely different. Ours, the cause for our aggregate, our physical aggregate, our body, are perhaps virtuous or non-virtuous karma, but this came about independent or through afflicted minds, through the presence of afflicted minds. So whether that contaminated karma is virtuous or non-virtuous, it was accumulated with the presence of afflicted minds.
Jisan sem dile gewa sem chi yoba ina dewa trut ko gewe sem chi gyulya gewe sem meba che gyulya dibe sem chi yoba ina dele tine dunga yong ko re chen dine enza nga zu lu le tui di nga zu lu de yang ane dunga chasan yong sa ge tian je lu de yang ane gyu nyom mo ba da and me dene ne jawa inza and jawa semlo tubare esede ne kimchen dene shire.
Those of us as humans, not those of us who are human, as humans, this is a rebirth and a happy migration came about independent on our previously having accumulated the contaminated karma of ethical restraint, which is a virtuous mind, but it was infused with ignorance of self-grasping. Hence, the karma is contaminated. Hence, that combined with our parents' attachment leads to the attainment of contaminated aggregates, the basis of suffering, or true sufferings. And therefore, we have this basis that serves to suffer, serves to experience suffering. So what we can see from this stream is that mind is primary, because the mind, whether virtuous or non-virtuous, still had afflictions present. Mind is primary. That is what led to the achievement of this, the attainment of this body. For those beings who are not like us, Arya Bodhisattvas, mind remains primary, because their mind is free of afflictions such as the ignorance of self-grasping, and therefore their karma is not contaminated, it's uncontaminated, or it's pure, and therefore they achieve a body through pure karma and prayer, and thereby it is not a basis for suffering. So whether one is an ordinary being or an extraordinary being, we should see that mind is primary, because it's in dependence on consciousness. Whether that consciousness is afflicted or not, that leads to the accumulation of contaminated or non-contaminated karma, impure karma or pure karma, and thereby leads to the attainment of a form body that is a contaminated aggregate, basis of suffering or not.
Semla tembe dunga chasan chi tsawi gyur samdana nga zo ya semla ya tu gore chesa dene enza dunga se di ya gyudi da dikwa se di cha gore dikwa dela dene dunga ya chi ane chikcha na da nga zo dewa se di ya tsawi gyu ane ya semla tu gore chesa di nga zo ge gewa se di gyu gewa chi tu na gewa dela dene dunga yung gore ane migewa chi le migewa chi tu na ane migewa dela dene nga zo dunga yung gore chesa da dewa da dunga se di nga zo ge tsawi gyudi ya samda ya tsewa tse shimju che tsewa ina dan dewi gyudi ane nga zo gewa re ane dunga gyudi migawa re chesa gewa da migawa se di sem cha gore chesa dine za dedu dewa da dunga se di nga zo tsawi sem tu gore se ji odu se.
Hoping now it's becoming clear why mind is primary, and which is the second outline that we're in now. So all suffering that we experience, whether physical or mental, mind is primary. And this is because the cause of suffering is consciousness. The cause of happiness too is consciousness. So therefore, if we're experiencing physical or mental happiness, this too comes primarily from consciousness. And this is because it's non-virtue which leads to suffering, virtue which leads to happiness. And whether something is virtuous or non-virtuous, whether an activity, a physical activity, a verbal activity, and of course a mental activity is virtuous or non-virtuous, depends on the motivating mind. So therefore, mind is primary, because it's from the motivating mind that one accumulates the causes that are virtue or non-virtue that lead to happiness and suffering. So here I encourage you now to during this class, look at this and see that the very root cause of all happiness is virtue, which is a way of thinking, it's mind. Consciousness as to is the root cause of suffering, being non-virtue, which is also consciousness. And therefore, mind is primary when we come to think about happiness and suffering.
안저 대화다 동아 세야디야 자와 셈을 투바이나 아니 대화 세야디 규개발했더니 용거래 동아 세야디 규 아니 제위기다 규디야 아니 디바세야디 용거래라로다 다연자 되네 안당 아주 그상 대시 아주 대선 숨바텔이야 아니 디바세야다 개와세야디 아니 규디 자와 개와다 셈나 가서 동아 용의 규자와디 디바레 Dewa young Yuzawa the Kawa Lavina, the Kawa the Diva said, Sem Ganachilla Kawa Lagore, Sem Ganachilla Dunga Lagores, and this one that you said the Hoyore Sachi Anzugi, that Chike Dikoria Chisha Chorada.
The Chiche Sumpa. Okay. Here, now we're coming to the conclusion of the second outline, which is that the root of all happiness and suffering is consciousness. So I hope this is clear, because that it is from the cause of happiness is virtue, which is consciousness. The cause of suffering is non-virtue, and that is consciousness. Whether the happiness and suffering is physical or mental, comes from a root of being consciousness. And this then brings us to the third outline, which is to look at negativities or non-virtue. What is its entity? What is it in its nature? What is the entity what is the entity of non-virtue, and where is non-virtue to be found? So this is the third outline, which has these two parts: the entity or the very nature of non-virtue or negativities, and where it is to be found.
Sanji Jumden de Korongi, Yamane, Yamyon Tone, Yamyon Yubi Tone, Arzule. Dijena, Dele Dibar Legres, Dibareta, Sanji di Sumba Hashi Chigla, Denigi, Gudi Teletene, Tebu Dunga Junguyovana, di Dibareta, as the same, some of Denischena, and the Dibares in the Sanji Sun, what been Korken and Dibaretas, Dibares. Chesnadi, Co Diba Sanji Denisuma Chilla, and the Korong naming it Tebutilla, Dunga Junguyovana, that the Nick can New Year taken Tella, that's Sem Della, Mother Dipa Allegore.
Come so? Control de
Miguel Dibareva, Chesanko Sanjigi, Honros and the Honros said Dibare, Sanjigi, Chixumache, the Sungo Sunga, Chesanji Sumba, Gashi Chilla, Digi naming in Tebutilla, Mahopana Tebuti, Dunga Jungubena, and the Divarese. That's Sanji, those Chena Gavare, Diniche or DJ and Gavare, Sonade, Sumba Kanshila, Diniki Chebi, Tebutilla, Mahopana, Deva Jungubena, naming it Deva Jungubena, the Gavare, Chesan Dineza, Manzul, that Gava Diva said, more connection with Sunguresan, Korongi. Naming it to the di Java Chepa, then Della, naming it to Dunga Chigda, and Divas. Korongo naming it to the Deva Chungubana, and Delam Kawas. The Anna Sanjigi, Sumba Kanshila, the Kaware, teaching the Kaware, teaching the Migaware, Sonshaba, Sumba Kanshila, and D. then the Tebutella Dunga Yunguyana, the Migavares. Zada, Dijabalatene. Jebu Maumban Jebu di Tewa Jungubana, the Kawares, or the Kawata Tipa said, as well so had dinner.
And Buddha Shakyamuni taught based on his faultless experience. His experience being faultless because he had perfected all good qualities and completely eradicated all faults, leaving not a trace. When he taught what the entity of virtue and non-virtue is, he did so first by pointing out what is non-virtuous and what is virtuous. For example, he taught that anger is non-virtue. And moreover, he didn't just point out this is non-virtue and therefore needs to be avoided, and this is virtuous and therefore needs to be cultivated. He taught the reason why something is virtuous or not. In other words, the entity or the essence of what virtue is and what non-virtue is. And the entity or essence of virtue and non-virtue is when it ripens. What does it ripen into? If it ripens into happiness, then it is virtue. If it ripens into a suffering experience, then it is non-virtue. So the essence of virtue is that it ripens into happiness. The essence of non-virtue, of negativities, is that it ripens into suffering.
Control naming table, Nanson Maki, Nansong Dunganyo, Nansong Tela Dunganyo, and Dimase, not me Telaya Dunganyo. Just that the Neza, control table de la Dungajo Amado, Devoya Mevare. Just that Mevanza, Coron control Corona, Chesan control di Migavares. Dinashi, Tanga Jugi, Shalia, Bene Sevocombi, Seva di, Tanga to Cavares. Chesan Sevocombi table de la Sevo combine di table de la Devoya, Devotion Mato, Dungayo Mevare. Mevanza, Seva di Necavares, the Bernardo, Per Masomana, control di, and then San Yuchimnedikia, control seti. Migaware, Chesan control segio mares, control set the Bangure, Sadi Sonyor, Chesan control set the Migawa San Sonyor. Chesan Sumba Nation control della Dene Jevocalios, Dumajore. Chesan Sebo Combaina, Nicahares, Chesan Sebo Congures, Subium Chegores, San Yusungorva. Chesan Deneza, Subigi, Dinashin, Sebo Combaina, Subi Tebu della Dehochon Yamado, Dumaya, Meva, Meva, the Petinashin, that Dinu for the Peshabana, Dinashida. Korongi table, Bendigo, Sevat, Casons, Kevata, Miguel Sage, Denisilum was on water.
Our third outline here is discussing what are negativities in terms of their essence or entity and where they're to be found. So continuing here, Buddha Shakyamuni taught that anger, for example, is non-virtuous, and its essence is non-virtuous because it leads to suffering, and therefore Buddha taught anger is to be abandoned. It's to be abandoned because its very essence is non-virtuous because it leads to suffering, and therefore it must be abandoned because that's an unwanted result. On the other hand, when the Buddha taught about patience, he gave patience as an illustration of virtue. And why is patience a virtue? Because it leads to happiness. Therefore, its essence is it's a virtue because it leads to happiness. And therefore, because you desire happiness, patience is to be cultivated. So anger, for example, when Buddha taught that it is a non-virtue because it leads to suffering, this is because being a non-virtue, if it ripens as a propelling karma, will only lead to rebirth in the lower realms. So only rebirth that it can lead to is in the lower realms. Moreover, if a karmic imprint of anger ripens on the continuum of a being in a happy migration, such as a human, it will still only lead to suffering. So a human will experience suffering when a previously accumulated imprint of anger ripens. So therefore, whether a karmic imprint of anger ripens as a propelling karma leading to a rebirth or is experienced within a rebirth, the result is solely suffering. Virtue, on the other hand, such as patience, is the opposite to this and leads only to experiences of happiness. Therefore, happiness being what we desire is to be cultivated, so virtue is to be cultivated, whereas not desiring suffering, non-virtue, such as anger, is to be abandoned.
Just didn't de Gawa and Dipani, because the Dewa and Dumani Gudi, Gawa the Dipa Chaware. Gawa the Dipa de more than the series. And the Gawa Dipa de Gawa Yore, Lamna, and Chilo Diva de Nansuki, Suki Chilo Payore, Nalo Yore, Suki Galo Yore, and the Gawa Yore, said Chevaina. Just Gawa the Dipa said, 아주 샘기 때도 여가지 샘기 때도 여가지 마도 수보래 치료기 지신다 되니게 사다 도다 줄이야 되니게 매바래 디바디 매바래 진짜 디바스에 가와 열어서는 아주 샘기 때도 여가자고 해지래 그 디바스에 가와 예매 예세 시디 제바 있나 다 아주 샘기 때도 여가지래.
The first part of this outline then is that the entity of virtue and non-virtue, this is that what it leads to. So non-virtue is the cause for the experience of suffering. So its entity is suffering. Virtue is the cause for happiness. So its entity or its essence is happiness. So non-virtue is a cause for suffering. Virtue, a cause for happiness. And where, for all of us, is our store of virtue and non-virtue to be found? Well, it's not out there in the world, it's not in our surrounding forest to be found, nor in our physical body. It's to be found on our continuum. That is where virtue and non-virtue is stored. It's found to be found only on our continuum.
심기 때도 여바 인자 다나 저기 디바세다 디비기 가서래 동의 육 디바세다 디비기 아니 가서래 개와세 니디 심기 때도 여바래 되니 인자 다나 저기 가르쳐고라서는 제가 나 저기 동의기 동아 못해 봐서 동아 매봐서 원자 동아 매봐서 봐라 동의 육 디바디 매봐 마서나 동아 매봐서 투에 매봐래 제가 곧 내가 매봐서나 야게 동아 용거를 못히네 윤튀네 레리거로 제가 동아의 규 동아의 매봐서 봐라 동아의 규 디바디 매봐서 고래지래 당한 저게 개화지 요 대화지 요야라 이 개화도 두고 걸마도 개화지 말으나 아니 대화디 요하요 말에 아니 저기 개위 규야 총총질에 되는 대화 뜻레베네 남사 개위 규디 아니 대화 그래서 대위 규 개화디 누가 침보면은 야 동할래 돼야 차거로 지네 장 저기 대화 되어 봐 인자 대위 규 동에 가서 개화도 두고 그래스 지상 대위 규 개화 두고 그래스 지상 동아 뭐 되어 봐서 동아 세고 그래 지상 동의 규 디바 봐 매봐서 그래 사지 어두스 차거로 봐다.
This third outline is important to understand. So when we gain clarity what the entity of virtue and non-virtue is, that it is virtue is what is the cause for happiness, and non-virtue the cause for suffering. When we understand this clearly, as well as that it's to be found, these are to be found on our own continuums, then we have conviction where we need to focus our attention, that it is on our inner world. When we understand with vivid clarity that all unwanted suffering comes about independent on the causes of suffering, being non-virtue, abiding on our continuum, we will know that that is what we need to strive to eliminate. That is what we need to strive to eliminate, the non-virtue abiding on our continuum. Because whatever we change around us may have some temporary, give us some temporary reprieve from difficulties, but only temporarily. To be completely freed from suffering, we need to attend with vigor to the causes of suffering that abide on our continuum, non-virtue. And similarly, with happiness, when we understand that the entity of happiness is virtue, because virtue results in happiness, then we'll know that we need to accumulate the causes of happiness, virtue. Because again, what we achieve in our outer world, this has an impact on us, but only temporary. If we want to experience, or in order to experience our desired and longed for stable happiness, we have to accumulate causes for happiness. If those causes are weak, it will have a limited result when it ripens. So therefore, we need to strive to accumulate greatly powerful virtue because of the more powerful results that will follow. So therefore, when we come to understand this third outline well, we will apply ourselves to eliminating the causes of suffering, non-virtue, which abides on our continuum, and apply ourselves to strive to accumulate the causes of happiness, virtue, which too abides on our continuum.
Dini dewa yung yagi yu gewa dinga to sami tendu yoba yinza ane nga zuki chike supu dilya gaze ki pene cawe dunga chike chik kanga seyo duyo changlo na siwu seyo ine ane gansam chikya ane a chabe dunga le ngurwa karasane dunga yu nubade mewa seyo marwa ko negapte ki kien chik tang shara mato ane dini ki chabe chawe du seyo di yang chik calo tang shaba ane yang chik du chine 차로 다시는 가슴 찔려야 차위 동을 내요. 그래서 셈이 때도 나 그 동화 계획이 누버디 귀디 여여 버려 딕비기다. 딕비기데 맞아 셈이 때도 여여 버려 봐. 되어서 내가 저기 치료기 같이 체비나 난게 셈이 땡기 딕바디 매봐 마셔나 아니 동화에 귀디 매봐 마셔 봐이나 기디나 아니 지 남사 되스되실래 아직 동화 용하야지 차고로 와. 디인상 저기 동화기 소수기 다 동화 영역의 규조의 셈미때도 디과의 여반자 아니 치료기 수불야 즉 특히 진료견의 간에스메바 서비네 아니 된자할 때 강함에가 수투고 말와 제가 디나시 디인자 대시쇼에 맞아 기스지와를 치며 송반하시 소소라 강아 체고의 시행 차상 수에 메바 서비네 소소 동화 세투 말레스 송와다 지바르와다 데네 장아 주큐라 동화의 규định 알아서 셈미때도 여바 인자 아니 치료게 가지 메바 서비네 동화의 규디레샤 디레샤 메바 소소샤베네 동화디 메바 규네 차교 말쳐서 동화디 용도야 돼 진짜 여어디 가서는 소수기 때도 수기 셈미 때도 동화의 규디 소 디바트 소수 셈미때도 여어디 말해도 진짜 내 여바자 디용의 규디 메바 마서데 치료게 끼엔디게 메바 서비네 핑교 말와 진짜 데네자 디로와
I want to repeat the point just made because it's important that you hear this and reflect on it again and again, because so much of our energy, physical, mental energy, goes into transforming our outer world, and this consumes us. Whereas if we use what remains of this life well by focusing on transforming the inner world, this will actually lead to a transformation in how we live, how we experience. So if we think of the time of year such as now when it's cold in your home, you know how to solve that. You turn the heating on, you wear warm clothing, and therefore you're quite comfortable. But we also know that that is just a temporary solution. Soon the temperature may drop and we need to wear more clothing and turn up the heating, or we may overheat and need to tone it down a little bit. And likewise we know from our experience in summer, sometimes it's a little bit hot, so at home we turn on the air conditioning, but then we start to get a little bit chilly, so we turn off the air conditioning. So all these outer changes that we put our time and energy into, they do alleviate difficulty, they do bring some happiness, but it's temporary. It transforms, it is lost with great ease and very quickly. So it's fine to look after the external world, we need to, but we need to transform our emphasis, turn our emphasis to the inner world. Hence the presentation thus far, establishing that the root cause of happiness and the root cause of suffering is consciousness. So we looked at this in terms of contaminated and uncontaminated karma, and we looked at it in terms of the essence of or the entity of virtue and non-virtue. It's all consciousness. This is where we need to put our attention, because no matter how well we change our external world, lasting, stable happiness cannot be achieved. Only fleeting happiness can be achieved. Hence the need always for more. And this was mentioned this morning too, with the verse that I referred to from Shantideva, that no matter how much we change our outer world, no matter how good conditions we have in terms of health, prestige and renown, material comforts. It's never satisfactory, it's never enough, because it doesn't provide lasting happiness or even lasting freedom from pain and difficulty. So therefore I encourage you, whilst looking after your external conditions, to turn your attention to the inner world, to cultivating the causes for happiness and eliminating those that will lead to suffering.
마지 겨베네 파쇼게 소소게 자원 미디 아줄리아 마자스 미디 모신고라 마도 모마신와제 강주 마주 제베네 디고 말와 제상 페니기 마자스 미디 갑데 따다 모신고라 디나신 아주게 동안 세들레 동아들이야 모신바시 당고 동아다 하고 와제 제상 다 동아 하고 해도 니 규데 하고 와제 디네 제네 남아주 동아 배워 써야라 쇠당디 쇠하네 쇠바디 쇠하나 레라 용고로
When we do experience difficulties, it's imperative that we know what the cause of those difficulties are. Because without knowing the cause, it's very difficult to remedy the suffering we're experiencing. Because if we are suffering and we don't know why, we know we get a bit anxious, we don't know what to do about it. Generally, with the cause of sufferings in the world, we know what the causes are, and we know what the remedies are, and we can effectively apply them. If we're a little cold, we know why and we know what to do. If we're ill, perhaps we know why and what to do, or we will seek out experts' guidance. And this is the same in all walks of life, and no more apparent than in warfare. Soldiers cannot be sent into battle if the enemy hasn't been identified. Moreover, the better that the commanders have identified the enemy, the more effective can soldiers be. So this is certainly the case with ourselves. We need to identify the cause of suffering in order to be able to effectively deal with it. And the more detailed we are in identifying the cause, the more effective we will be in eliminating it.
Dine inzada nga zuge dunga se de ngoshin ya le nga zu samasta we na bene nga zu ya chi namshi changmo shin de nga chagi du simi chabe dunga du s le gor wa da che chabe dunga du se dunga de khawa de su de rebe lamna su de mare chabe dunga su de mare su de maena an garre lamna dine ge chabe dunga se chabe ge chowa shu yung go re de di chowa dunga re 차비가 초와슈 영하고 영하죠와 디둥아로와 되네가 지금 수보를 말아 쓰는 낮에 땅도 수보디 네 둥아 말에 가서 가지고 가서 둥아 말에서나 다딩 내갑디 디 가지고 둥아가 둥아 연구도 해야 돼 가지고 영하기 하고 해야지 가지고 가라고 그러선 빼나 수시고자도 되네기 둥아디 영하기 초와시키고 그래 니 초와디 둥아래 되래 진짜 둥아세 아주 데 아주게 데 상이 좀 된디기 낭비 흉내 둥아요 뭐에서나 둥아고 시디 둥아들 좀 숨쉬고 그래 둥아요 둥아 규요 둥아 차바두지기 둥아 좀 숨쉬고 그래 시여도 넘빙아 저게 당아도 직대나가 아장아 강아 둥아 차베 둥아도 산 저도베 둥아도 세다 안지게 나외 둥아 용세데 둥아데 차상 나 정어 소야디 둥아 세데 둥아 세데 가서 동아 인방을 숨고 삼고동 니 가르라나 초와지래 동아 녀에게 초와들래 동아 용원도 녀한테 초와 제거 제자디 셰바래 제상 가지고 남밍아 저 셰바 하고 말아 제자 동아 용구도 만나기도 동아 라마도 디 하고 두고 말 제자 디 녀에게 동아디 초와 동아들래 디 동아 세 차거래 디 동아도 라과되는 거 좀 하고 레라래
now to start to look at more detail as to the causes of suffering. Let's take a suffering that we all recognize, can recognize with great ease, and that's the suffering of being cold. Usually when we talk about, I'm really cold, we're referring to, my body is cold. But the experience of suffering, whilst connected to our physical temperature, is not our physical temperature. The experience of suffering is a feeling of suffering, so consciousness. So again, when we are suffering due to cold, our body temperature is one of cold, but it's not that specific temperature that makes all beings cold, and therefore suffer. It's rather the arisal of the mind, which is called the feeling of suffering. That is what we point out here and say, I'm suffering because I have the feeling of suffering, the experience of suffering. So just to say as an aside here, in Buddhist psychology, the term feeling is used differently from in English. There are 3 types of feeling: happiness or pleasant feelings, suffering, and neutral feelings. Those 3. So it's not how we use it in English, but that's important to understand. So when we are experiencing suffering, we are experiencing a feeling of suffering. When we're experiencing happiness, we are experiencing a pleasant or a happy feeling. This is what is meant by suffering or happiness, this feeling that's arisen. So when Buddha taught suffering, he divided it up in different ways. The best known is the threefold division, with the first being physical and mental suffering, the second being the suffering of transitory pleasure, and the third being all-pervasive suffering. So here we're talking about the first of these three types, the suffering of physical and mental suffering. And what is physical and mental suffering? It's suffering that has arisen in dependence on our body or dependence on our minds, and it is experienced as the feeling of suffering. That is what is meant by suffering. The arisal of the feeling of suffering. Amongst the 3 types of feeling, it's the feeling of suffering. And that is what is meant by suffering.
Gyuru dunga se dile zugi nekap tsowa pete dewa sakche sigruwa desole gyuru dunga la or pena nga zugi tete nga zu kyadi kapla salo tanshi sosulia subule chike dwele yando den mi deshi kyabi dunga ma mewa chagando nga sosulia subulia chike dwegi nyochin delala nyocyorwa ndi tsowa chagro dewi tsoyu dwegi tsowa nyoya delala nyoya tsowa dila dewarwa chidanga du deware de sakchigi dewa sigre chidan dia delya gyuru dunga la gore jina sangye 좀 ngana jogi nangbe chue na shide de dewa tempo mares chidan ko gyuru dunga ko ganzam chiglia gyuru je dunga ngo gyuru es chidan gyuru kores dia ro dang zu chalo da sha ben du je da ganzam chiglia de ne chawa chen oda yang jamo ji gu sam li ro chidan de ni gi de kyabe kapla chalo da shi dewa je chowa delala de di dewa di ngana jo de myune jidin yong da la nga zo dewa sig ro di dewa re chidan de la nga zo ge 최기 돈의 시행도 될에 사치기 되와레스 제가 될에 민 안에 동아리 될 규율 동아라 그래서 대화 때문에 규율 동아습니다 그래서
And happiness, so we've mentioned now that there are 3 types of suffering, pleasant or happy feelings, suffering feelings, and neutral feelings. So we mentioned that there are 3 types of suffering. The first being physical and mental suffering, the second being the suffering of transitory pleasure, and the third being all-pervasive suffering. Or to translate this in different ways, the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. We look now briefly at the first, the suffering of physical and mental suffering. And this is experienced through the feeling of suffering. So the feeling of suffering is the first of the 3 types of suffering, physical and mental suffering. Then the second type of this threefold division of suffering, the second type, the suffering of transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change. This is quite different. The first type was suffering feelings, or feelings of suffering. Now the second type, the suffering of transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change, is quite different. So if we, for example, cold, that's the suffering of physical and mental suffering, or suffering of suffering. Then we turn on the heater, and we're now quite happy, because now we're nice and warm. So before, we're experiencing a suffering feeling, because we're cold. Now we're nice and warm, and we're experiencing a happy feeling. We're now quite toasty, and we're very happy. But this feeling of happiness, now from a Buddhist perspective, our Dharma perspective, is called contaminated happiness. So we spoke about contaminated karma before. This is now contaminated happiness. It's a feeling of happiness, but this happiness is contaminated. And this happiness, this feeling of happiness, or this contaminated happiness, this is what is meant by the suffering of transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change. So it's actually the feeling of happiness is called the suffering of change, or the suffering of transitory pleasure. So that maybe sounds counterintuitive, but certainly not in accordance with the world. This is what the world strives for. What society strives for is the feeling of happiness, this transitory happiness, this contaminated happiness. So why, from our Dharma perspective, is this happiness called suffering? And it's because the suffering, it's contaminated, it's transitory, it doesn't last and results in suffering. For example, we're cold, we turn on the heating, we're now nice and warm, but that happy feeling coming from the warmth doesn't last. Eventually we'll be too hot, and it has transformed then from the suffering of transitory pleasure back into a new form now of physical and mental suffering, or the suffering of suffering. So therefore, because the feelings of happiness are transitory and will result in continued suffering, the feeling of happiness, or pleasant feelings, is called suffering. In particular, the suffering of transitory pleasure.
당저 캬와 두지기 둥아세야디 다 레다 녀모 오미주 가서 풍보디길래 풍보디시고 디 캬와 두지 둥아시고 다 지디 용다라 가 주기 둥아세야디 규 둥아세야다 캬와 두지 둥아세야디 데 둥아이바 하고 두요 두고 아마 둥아디고 계셔봐 시고 말봐 아니 지장한 주기 지디 용다라 둥아세야디 아니 둥아 용무도 시에마다 십서울아지 기셰베네 저런 둥아 용구도 간스 용구도 둥아디 가르레 간스 레슨 기셰베네 알람 셰카고로 자기래 지상 갈슨 따따든 것은 두고 맵다래.
We've looked now at two of the three types of suffering. So the feeling of suffering is what arises when we experience that first type of suffering, the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of physical and mental pain. The second type of suffering is actually the feeling of happiness. And this happiness is contaminated happiness, it's transitory. And this is the second type of suffering, the suffering of transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change. Then the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering, or its full name, all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. This refers to our having the basis for suffering, our having physical and contaminated physical and mental aggregates, these physical and mental aggregates that are in the nature of suffering. So the mere having of these contaminated aggregates is what is meant by the third type of suffering, that of all-pervasive suffering, because this is the basis upon which the other two types of suffering arise. So of that threefold division of suffering, the first type, the suffering of physical and mental suffering, all beings, everyone in the world, everyone in society accepts that and wants to be freed of that. But the second two types, the suffering of transitory pleasure and all-pervasive suffering, these are unknown in society. And in fact, society would have a bit of a hard time accepting them because they haven't come to understand the philosophy behind them. And the shortcoming of not gaining clear understanding, experiential understanding of these second two types of suffering is that one doesn't know the root causes of suffering. One just thinks about very superficial causes. I'm cold, therefore I need to turn on the heating. But it's not aware of the deeper levels from which suffering arises.
하람 갈라도 오다가 지금 자기도 세라도 걸어와다 다 차바 장모 슈데 동아 임바이나 근데 작바디게 차산 동아 슈 차리 걸어와 다가 차위 동아 슈 용도 쓰되 차와집이 동아 용도 라게도 아니 가래스네 아 수부 슈 차기 치기도 차와도 차바디레스네 차와데네 님에다 메디게 차산 게디네 동아 차도와 님에 동아레베스는 동아레레 말봐 님마다 메다 그래서 동아레베스는 동아레레 말봐 동아 말레라 걸어와 제산의 착바다 추정모듯이 동아레베스는 동아 말레라 걸어와 안단 수부 정모데 추정모 등아 마야 아주 수부 정모데 동아야 말봐 메차보다 님마 차보데 동아 마이나 안도 수부 차보데 동아 차야 말봐 다 동아 가래라나 다게 요라시마데스는 쪼라야게 냥아요 봐 제제 동아세데 간데 라마시데 제 오다데 요라소데 데네 시모야서 코로나야게 냥아요 봐 벤둥아니스 마신 왜나 지자당아도 동아데 가르레스는 심주 제야도 제상 수부 차와 코로나 동아레민도 제상 차와 용위게 초와데 동아레샤스 수부 장모 코로나 동아 말에 장모 용위게 동아 장모 용데게 초와데 동아레서다 제상아도 동아세야데 초와질 거고 그러다 단 넘진지대 용라라 초위기 용구도 마도 되니게 야와 체제 디제샤 세데 모송야데 깔래하고 채고로 와
The key point being made here is that what is suffering? It's a feeling of suffering. And this is important to be clear on, because in the world this isn't really thought about. It's not that it's completely unknown, but it's certainly not thought about and not thought about in detail. Because generally when we say, I have a suffering feeling arise because it's so cold, we would look to our body and say, my body is cold and I'm suffering. And we'd think of our body here and the temperature of our body as being suffering. But really we should be looking at the feeling of suffering. This is the experience of suffering. Likewise, if it's hot and we're perspiring and we're finding we have no energy, then we are more likely, because this is how we are conditioned in society, to blame the external condition. Whereas that is merely a condition, our experience of suffering is due to the arisal of the feeling of suffering. So it's important then to know this clearly, that it's the feeling of suffering that is suffering, not the temperature of our body, whether our body is overly hot or overly cold. Because not everyone will experience a particular temperature in the same way. If it was necessarily the temperature, everyone would experience it, all beings would experience it in the same way. But it's a arisal of the feeling of suffering that is suffering. So when we understand what suffering is, we need to think that it is the feeling of suffering.
나데네 장도 심지체 되가지고 동아 녀야디 가지고 동아 용도 세 동아도 초월해 돼요. 제사디 초월이 동아 녀야기 초와디기 그 사번 말씀은 규소와 년龄 유주 사번의 가요였으네. 수부된도 요 말에 셈이된도 요래. 아 셈이된도 요래. 제사 셈이된도 요 봐인자 수부된도 요 말에 셈이된도 요 말에. 제사 셈이된도 데니기 동안여에게 사번이 매나 수볼이야 차와 같이 차베네 아주 가서래 차위 동안용 말에 당 아주 동안 장위 동안여에게 소화기에게 뉴바디 셈기되는 매바 있나 수부 장모 같이 차베네 차베 동안용 말에 제사디 소화기 차베 동안여에게 소화기에게 뉴바디 셈기되는 요고 그래 안에 아주 동안 차위 동안여에게 소화디기에게 뉴버디 셈이된도 요거래 셈이된도 디 매바이나 수부까지 차바이나 차유동안 리 말에 기 말에 그래서네 뉴버 호랑 기에게 초와 차유동안 녀에게 뉴버 녀 초와 녀에게 초와디 유사번디 요 말와 아니 장모 수부 장모 같이 차바이나 자유동안 녀요 말 그래서네 장비기 초와 녀에게 초유기 저 녀에게 유사번의 셈이 되는 매도와 매반자 수부 장모다 차와 같이 차이네 안에 누가 녀야시 차가 말 제산당가서 셈이 때도 초와 누가 녀야기 사번디 셈이 때도 여대바 인자建수불이야 차유제 포야도 디기建전에 되네 고 안에 가서 차유 누가 녀야 수불이야 장모제 장모의 내용도 장유자체 체여도 디기建전에 장유 누가 녀야 차야디 예디디 차고래 배네 그래서 사번주쇼에나 추가절루베네 사번매나 추가절루는 유기기 말와 지상 사번주 예체위제라 인데레 kiến 추다 류다 사디 체여도 되는 유기기 거라 배디나 지바 차고라.
This is an important point then to gain clarity on, that suffering refers to the feeling of suffering. Because understanding this with clarity, when we say it's a feeling of suffering, we know that this is consciousness. And consciousness comes about, is impermanent, it comes about in dependence on causes. Consciousness has a seed. So this seed then we need to identify, because it's the ripening of a particular seed that results in a particular feeling of, for example, suffering. That seed, of course, isn't to be found in the garden, nor is it to be found in our physical body, but rather on our mental continuum. That's where our seeds abide. And furthermore, so taking it a little further, we spoke about that suffering is the feeling of suffering, the seeds of our feelings, of our suffering feelings, happy feelings, these abide on our continuum. And as long as we have these seeds, and we have the potency, we therefore have the potency to experience, or the potential to experience the suffering, feelings of suffering, we will then experience feelings of suffering. If we lack these seeds, if they have been eradicated, we will not therefore have the potential to experience feelings of suffering. This is important, because as long as we have the potential to experience feelings of suffering, we will suffer. We will suffer because it's cold, we will suffer because the heat has now made the room too hot. We will continue to experience suffering as long as we have on our continuum the potential to suffer. We have the seeds for the feeling of suffering. When those are eradicated, no matter how cold it is, no matter how hot it is, we will not experience the feeling of suffering, because we no longer have the seeds for the feeling of suffering on our continuum. So this is important, to get clear that suffering is a feeling. Being a feeling, it comes from a ripening of a seed on our continuum. And as long as one has those seeds, one has the potential to suffer. When those seeds have been eradicated, one will not have the potential to suffer. This is important to know, because it again emphasizes where we need to put our attention.
어디나신 직발에 나도 셈데라 대위 초반용하기 세븐직 매바이나 안에 세븐디메나 되는 아주 그 대화용하기 직차비 갑라 되는 이미 돼 포베네 초와 대화의 기투 말에 그래서는 대화용의 초와 대화 기기 말아서는 소위 대화기 세븐디 셈이던도 요 말와 어디나신 대화에다 하래 대화이네야 대화세야 되는 아주 그 초와 대화 되는기 대화 기여도 갑라 게 유사번지 고고디 사번디 안데 셈기 녀몽 초와 코로나 셈 셰바 인자 그런 게 사번디야 뉴버디 가요 셈이 된도 요걸마도 치 셈내 신 수소를 된도 요요 말에 디나신 초와 동안요아디야 초와 동아디 셰바 인자 그런 게 유사번디 셈이 된도 요걸마도 수소라서 봐 요요 말에 매반자다 초와 동아세나다 초와 대화세다 디스니가 녀야기 유사번이 그런 게 The
previous segment then, we spoke about the feelings of suffering. It's exactly the same then for the contrary feelings of happiness or feelings of pleasure. Feelings of pleasure, then these being feelings or consciousness, they have arisen in dependence on seeds on our continuum. as long as we have the seeds to experience happiness, they can ripen in dependence on meeting the required conditions, and we'll experience happiness, we'll experience pleasure. So the process is exactly the same. If we have the seeds that lead to the feeling of suffering, as soon as we meet those required conditions, that will ripen into suffering. So, same too with our desired happiness. So long as, to the extent that we have feelings, the seeds that can ripen into the feelings of happiness, we will experience happiness. So understanding then these 2 points, that both feelings, that happiness and suffering are feelings, they're consciousness, they come about in dependence on the ripening of seeds on our continuum, our mental continuum, we then know that we need to put our emphasis on cultivating the imprints that do abide on our continuum. Not to place our emphasis on external phenomena. We need to take care of external phenomena, but that is not where our emphasis, where all our energy should be placed. A disproportionate amount of energy should be placed. Rather, we should place more energy on the cultivation of the seeds of happiness and the eradication of the seeds of suffering.
Dini inza da nganzuki yosa kehoki gewa kasa dewa yoya ki chowa ki nubadi semgi tendo yore dunga ki chobi dunga ki nubadi da semgi tendo yoba inza da nganzo karche gore labna jeza pena nganzuki dirwada lakpa ya chokwa khowe na lakpa tu ormado dong tu bigi phasyo marwa 제 동로做过可把约为呢동的要不住嘛都老不住被判要嘛是吧第那些这个东方样是个宇做十分的什么一点都要把人家你没把说完了我就什么来讲都吃过来什么来讲都吃没把说嘛都什么的讲都买这把这驴呀都罗要呀的那这个这个驴猪的长嘛是驴这为呢东方给用嘛都东方没把说推要嘛没把让这个동화 영화의 유조 영화에 가와요 버선 뉴버디 셈기때도 요래 셈기때도 요바상 셈기때도 동화기 영화의 뉴버디 매바서 고래 디 매바서도 셈코랑 장도를 제제 셈려야 뉴셈코랑 장곰 장도의 셈려 유와 다제 매바서 고래 지난 당아서 대화 영화의 유조에 대한 뉴버디 셈기때도 용 고래 지난 셈기때도 요반상 셈기때라 근데 장도를 제제 곰시 제제 셈들래 대화 영화의 유디 뉴버체를 줘 제자다 심기때도 대화용의 그 규다 규 뉴버대다 아니 동화의 그 뉴버니가 심기때도 여바 인자 또 뉴버 동화용의 그 규 뉴버의 심기때 여바도 매바설 심을 장도를 제시 매바서 그래 제자 심을 장도를 제시 뉴버의 매바서 샤바 있나 되네 동화용아요 말이지 제자 되네 인장 안 주기 상여 줌내 디기 아주 동화세야 된 디기 주변 탈름 쪼디 가르친 것은 치용업을 주탈을 마송하지 쪼디 낭 셈을 유어 땅 고래스 제상 퇴바제 삼바제 곰자 고래스 되네 곰잡니 매바서 고래스 윤센 디레 제상 곰게데 나보 퇴 삼나 땅송퇴 망보 야 되네 제고단 퇴 되네 don다디 야네 양도 삼다 되네 하고 양도 셈을 곰게데 셈도 유어 곰문에 곰네 셈도 유어 땅 거로 제상 곰네 셈도 유어 땅에도 되네 셈이 땡기 네 동아기 뉴버디 매바서 고로 제가 되네 상아주 상여 줌는 디기 주의 탑람대다 동아세계 탑람디 조 셈이 땡이야 아니 유어 땅제 아니 냠는 제고래서 송고에 김센데 디레다
Through this presentation, hopefully it's now clear that what is suffering and what is happiness is the feeling of suffering, the feeling of happiness. And that this being a feeling, it's consciousness, which means it's come from a seed that's on our continuum. And in dependence on the strength of the potencies of the feelings of suffering and the feelings of happiness will be how much suffering and happiness we experience. I hope this is clear, because otherwise one puts one's energy in an area that does not lead to the result one desires. It's just like, for example, if one's face is dirty, no matter how much one washes one's hands, one's face doesn't become clean. In order to clean one's face, that is what one needs to wash. And it's the same here. Wanting to experience happiness, wanting to be freed from suffering, primarily we need to focus on our inner world. We need to focus on transforming our way of thinking, transforming how we interact with others, how we interact with everything. Because it's independent on our minds that we experience suffering or experience happiness. So this is what we need to focus on. Not wanting to suffer, but understanding that suffering is a feeling, and that feeling comes from seeds which abide on our continuum. We know then that is what we need to purify, what we need to eliminate, cleanse away, become freed of. Likewise, knowing that happiness too is a feeling. And that feeling comes about in dependence on seeds on our continuum. We therefore know that we also need to put energy into cultivating those seeds that will lead to happiness. And the method for doing so is what the Buddha Shakyamuni taught. In all his teachings, he focused his students on their inner world, on the cultivation of their inner world. He didn't teach his students how to transform the outer world. He taught them how to transform their inner world. A wide variety of techniques, but it comes down to developing our way of thinking, transforming our way of thinking, and how to do so. With analogies we've heard often, thinking of our continuum as like a scale. And we need to tip our scale towards the side of virtue. And through doing so, we will weaken the contrary side of non-virtue. How to do so? Hear teachings, reflect on them, meditate on them, and do so not sporadically, because sporadic hearing and reflection will not lead to transformation. It needs to be sustained, repeatedly hearing teachings and reflecting on them. This is how we develop new habit patterns, break old habit patterns. And it's developing and breaking habit patterns, which is the changing of the balance on our scales. As you develop habituation to virtue, weaken habituation to non-virtue. To express it differently, to develop habituation to virtuous ways of thinking and weaken our habituation to non-virtuous ways, afflicted ways of thinking. And this comes about in dependence on hearing, reflecting, and meditating repeatedly over a sustained period.
Gyudan kien meba la yungu oma gyudan kien che tili gore chizan dewa dan dunga kare ne gyudan kien ne tili gore deyang gyudan kien tili yang zo ya pa nganzu ya shimju cheba ina ta dedu yonya ge gyu zo de zawa de nganzu semle ya tu gore semle yo tu gore chizan semle tu ba inza ta nganzu semde ane nganzu ge deki yonya ge gyudi semyi tendo drupu kore dunga yonya ge gyudiya semyi tendo yor di meba syo war chizan nganzu samlo gyuwa tang chene meba syo ku kore eche chizan deya gyudan dunga meba syo deya ane gyudan kien chile tuyne meba syo kore ma de gyudan kien chile ma de ba koron drupdu ya gyudan kien chile dru yongwa inza ko meba syo deya gyudan kien chile tene meba syo ku kore chizan gewa deya nganzu gyudan kien chile tene ane drupu kore chizan dene inza di semle semyi tendo tu kuwa, chizan zo semla nyamlen che kore sache, da zo zawa semla tu, chizan sem kukyo gyuwa tanggo biko gom nyamlen che ne gyuwa tanggo kore mato gom nyamlen ma che ba, ane sem gyuwa tang tuku ma re sache, donda zo dire, chizan dine yanzang sanyi chumlen di ki chue son ye ki de, zayi ki ko deki tuya dunga seya le, sem nyamlen che da gom nyamlen che kore sache, songore mato, ane di songwa di gyumchen yana dine re che, ade ngazu ki dine ke sam tangche. Chazan da dine yanza, ngazu o da ngazu dunga chi meba soba ina, da sosu ki sem ki tendo dunga yonya ki gyu, ane kisi migawa seya di meba soba udu samche. Chazan migawa seya di dine re sha sambe me soya goya da. Da di ma soya na tab minu sambe sam tangya chikdang, anda da ngazu le dewa dan kibu chi kukore, chazan digi yonya la 디 나네 유조데다 셈르 투고도 제가 셈르 투바엔자 마주기 디기윤 유조디 셈게 된도 루포고 대자 대야 아니 곰 냠는 제는마도 투투마 대장에디 디기 투비야 규디 아니 셈게 된도 안주와 따제 아니 곰 냠는 지긴 셈베게 당저 셈슈 계제 당저도 상당과디 배수셔고바디 다 디링게 셔야디기 네수 디차고래 나 상이마 셔야디 당저게 셈게 된도 디바당 다 동아기에 유 디바세 셈미테도 요래 안 대와 디기요 유 규디 셈미테도 개와 셈미테 용구요 바이나 당아도 디바 매바 쇠야들야 샤야데 간에 샤고래 세제 디바 매바 샤고야다 안네디 안네 디기요 유 개와데 셈미테도 누바철 땅야 땅고야데 다 간에 땅고래 세데 다 상이 마 디바 샤다 거다 모두스지네야 쉬야지
상이 Tibetan gewa
Tibetan tinyam de legerwada.
Opportunity being impermanent, we come now to the end of our second session together. So to summarize what we've been looking at in the session, is all the happiness that we desire and experience and all the suffering that we wish to be freed from, as well as the suffering we experience, comes about in dependence on causes and conditions. When we look deeply, we'll see that those causes are consciousness. There'll be a variety of other conditions. Some could be consciousness, some could be material. But at a deeper level, the causes are always consciousness. Because, as we've heard, suffering is the feeling of suffering. Happiness is the feeling of happiness. So therefore, these causes, at a deeper level, the causes of happiness and suffering, are consciousness rather than material. And therefore, this is where we need to put our energy, at the accumulation of the causes for happiness and elimination of the causes that lead to suffering. And this is because if happiness and suffering are dependencies, dependent arisings, dependent on causes or conditions, they can be eliminated. How so? Through cultivating, in terms of suffering, the contrary causes. And how do we cultivate happiness? Through cultivating those causes. The causes for happiness and suffering, these are dependent arisings, as are the experiences or the feelings of suffering and happiness. And this is a key point, because it means we have influence. We can do something about our current situation. We can completely transform our current situation because it is dependent on our efforts. It's dependent on our striving to accumulate the causes for happiness and to eliminate the causes that would lead to suffering. What is this method that we should be applying ourselves to? Hearing and reflecting on what we've heard. Because without meditation, based on knowledge, no deep transformation can come. Meditation lacking knowledge, or knowledge without meditation, will not lead to lasting transformation. So we need to hear, reflect, and meditate repeatedly over a sustained period in order to bring about a transformation. So hearing this, I hope, brings some enthusiasm to one's mind, because with our current situation, as well as our desired situation, being a dependency, it gives us influence. It means we can transform our situation. It is within our control. And the more we hear and the more we reflect, the greater our skill will become, the greater our store of virtue will become. As we become ever more aware of this inner transformation, the effort that we put in will seem time well spent, and we want to put in ever more effort. And independent on the skill and the energy that we apply to our inner transformation, that will lead to an ever more rapid transformation coming about. So this is in brief, a brief summary of what we've been looking at thus far. We've looked at 3 of the 4 outlines. Now tomorrow we'll come to the 4th outline, which is how to confess and purify negativities, as well as what accompanies this, which is how to accumulate virtue. So this fourth outline is what we'll look at tomorrow then.
Oh, yeah,
And thank you very much.